Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 4th. This day in 1968 marked a pivotal moment that shook the United States and the world: the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. King, the foremost leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, was fatally shot in Memphis, Tennessee. His death not only robbed the nation of a visionary leader, but also ignited a series of events that further exposed the profound struggles and divisions within American society. Today, we're going to talk about Dr. King's life, his death, and his legacy. Let's get started. By the spring of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was already a Nobel Peace Prize winner and the leading voice of the civil rights movement. His journey into history began more than a decade earlier, back in the mid-1950s, when he helped lead the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. That boycott lasted for over a year and ended with the desegregation of public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. It wasn't just a victory for one city, it was a spark that ignited a national movement. As the years went on, Dr. King became the face of that movement. Throughout the 1960s, he led countless marches, protests, and campaigns, standing up against the deeply rooted system of segregation, especially in the South. One of the most pivotal moments came during the Birmingham campaign, where Dr. King and others courageously confronted segregation head-on in one of the most racially divided cities in the country. The images from Birmingham, peaceful protesters, many of them children, facing down police dogs and fire hoses, captured the nation's attention and forced Americans to reckon with the ugly reality of racism. Of course, when most people think of Dr. King, they think of that day in August 1963 when he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. His "I Have a Dream" speech has since become one of the most iconic moments in American history. His dream of a world where people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, has echoed through generations. Dr. King's leadership and a commitment to nonviolence were instrumental in the passage of two landmark pieces of legislation: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws struck at the heart of segregation and voter suppression and brought legal victories to a movement that had already won the moral argument. But by the late 1960s, Dr. King wasn't content to rest on those victories. He began to broaden his focus, speaking out about economic injustice in the Vietnam War. This new direction was not universally welcomed, and even some of his allies were hesitant. But Dr. King knew that the struggle for civil rights wasn't just about race. It was about dignity, fairness, and humanity for all. In 1968, he launched the Poor People's Campaign, an ambitious effort to unite Americans of all races who were trapped in poverty. His plan was bold. He wanted to bring thousands of people to Washington, D.C. to demand jobs, fair wages, and decent housing. To Dr. King, poverty wasn't just an economic issue, it was a moral failure of the nation. While preparing for this campaign, Dr. King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support striking sanitation workers. These workers, mostly black men, were fighting for safer working conditions and fair pay after two of their colleagues were tragically killed on the job. For Dr. King, their struggle perfectly symbolized the intersection of race, class, and dignity. Even amid threats to his life and mounting internal divisions within the movement, he stood firm, preaching nonviolence and justice. What Dr. King couldn't have known is that this trip to Memphis would be his last. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968, the air was thick with tension, both inside the civil rights movement and within the city itself. He had come to stand with the striking sanitation workers whose simple demand for fairer wages and safer working conditions had captured national attention. Dr. King believed deeply in their cause. Just weeks earlier, he had tried to lead a peaceful march through Memphis, but that march ended in violence. something that weighed heavily on him. As a lifelong champion of nonviolence, he returned to Memphis determined to show the world that a peaceful demonstration was still possible. That night, Dr. King gave what would become his final and perhaps most haunting speech. Standing before a crowd at the Mason Temple, he delivered the now famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. Storms had kept attendance low at first, but people braved the weather, eager to hear Dr. King speak. And he did not disappoint. He spoke on the mounting threats that he had received, the uphill battle for justice, and the importance of perseverance. Toward the end of his speech, his words took on an almost prophetic tone. Quote, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." End quote. Many who were there would later say that it felt as though Dr. King knew what was coming. April 4th seemed at first like a calm day. Dr. King spent it at the Lorraine Motel, a modest but familiar place that he often stayed while visiting Memphis. He spent time with close friends and colleagues, including Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and Jesse Jackson. They worked out the details of the upcoming march to support the sanitation workers. Then, later that afternoon around 6 p.m., Dr. King stepped out onto the balcony of room 306, the room he always stayed in when visiting the city. He was getting ready to attend dinner at the home of a local minister and took a moment to chat casually with friends below. And then the unthinkable happened. A single gunshot rang out. The bullet struck Dr. King in the lower right jaw, passing through his neck and causing catastrophic injuries. He collapsed instantly. His friends, frozen for a moment in shock, rushed to his side. Some pointed frantically to where they believed the shot had come from. Others tried to help as chaos swept through the motel. Dr. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. Surgeons did everything they could, but it was too late. At 7:05 p.m., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. News of the assassination spread like wildfire, first in Memphis, then throughout the nation, and eventually around the globe. Outside of the Lorraine Motel, mourners gathered almost immediately. Some prayed, some cried openly, and others simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process the loss. In the hours and days that followed, shock and sorrow rippled far beyond Memphis. In cities across the United States, people took to the streets, some to mourn, some to protest. The nation was left to grapple not only with the loss of Dr. King, but also what his death meant for the future of the movement he had led. The assassination of Dr. King didn't just shock the world, it immediately launched one of the largest, most urgent manhunts in American history. Within minutes of the shooting, investigators were on the ground at the Lorraine Motel, scanning the scene for any sign of the assassin. It didn't take long to find a critical clue. Just across the street from the motel was a rundown boarding house on South Main Street. From the second-floor communal bathroom, there is a direct and clear line of sight to room 306 and where Dr. King had been standing. Near the boarding house, police discovered a hastily discarded bundle of personal items. Inside was a Remington Model 760 rifle fitted with a scope, a pair of binoculars, a radio, and several other items, including Canadian currency and a map of Atlanta. But the most damning piece of evidence? Fingerprints. Clear, unmistakable fingerprints belonging to James Earl Ray. At the time, Ray was already a wanted man. He had escaped from the Missouri State Penitentiary the year before, where he had been serving time for robbery and burglary. Now he wasn't just an escaped convict. He was the prime suspect in one of the most high-profile assassinations in American history. Meanwhile, President Lyndon B. Johnson, upon hearing the devastating news of Dr. King's death, addressed the nation, urging calm. He declared April 7th a national day of mourning and pleaded with Americans to honor Dr. King's commitment to nonviolence. But the heartbreak and the fury were too deep, too raw, and they erupted. In the days that followed, more than 100 cities across the country were swept up in civil unrest. Major cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, Kansas City, and Louisville saw protesters, riots, and fierce clashes between demonstrators and law enforcement. In Washington alone, over 1,200 buildings were set on fire. Many called these disturbances riots, but to those who lived them, they felt more like rebellions. An outpouring of frustration born from years, even generations, of racial injustice, poverty, and oppression. The government responded swiftly. The National Guard and federal troops were deployed to more than a dozen cities. Martial law was declared in some areas, and strict curfews went into effect. By the time the dust settled, at least 46 people had died, thousands were injured, and more than 20,000 were arrested. The property damage alone ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet, amid the turmoil, there were also moments of peace and dignity. In countless neighborhoods, people gathered for candlelight vigils, silent marches, and heartfelt memorial services. Dr. King's death also made some lawmakers wake up. Many leaders began to recognize that what was happening in the streets wasn't just chaos, it was a reckoning. Within a week, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, banning discrimination in housing, an issue that Dr. King had passionately advocated for. Then came April 9th, 1968. On April 9th, 1968, tens of thousands gathered in Atlanta for Dr. King's funeral. Civil rights leaders, government officials, and everyday people came together united in grief, but also in purpose. While the nation mourned, law enforcement had a purpose of its own: to catch James Earl Ray. The FBI took over the investigation and set an international manhunt into motion. Ray, seemingly always one step ahead, left Memphis almost immediately after the shooting. He first went to Atlanta, then made his way to Toronto, Canada. There, he was able to secure a Canadian passport under the name Ramon George Snade. From there, he moved across Europe, traveling through Lisbon and eventually settling for a time in London. For weeks, Ray evaded capture, but on June 8, 1968, more than 2 months after Dr. King's assassination, his luck ran out. Scotland Yard officers arrested him at Heathrow Airport just as he was about to board a flight to Brussels. Authorities later believed that he was trying to make his way to Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe, one of the few countries at the time without an extradition treaty with the U.S. Ray was returned to the United States, where he was formally charged with Dr. King's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were on the rifle and the scope, and ballistic tests matched the rifle to the fatal bullet. Faced with these facts, Ray pleaded guilty on March 10, 1969, which allowed him to avoid a trial and the possibility of a death sentence. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But almost as soon as the ink dried on his plea agreement, Ray began to change his story. He recanted his confession, claiming that he had been set up as a scapegoat by a mysterious man named Raoul. According to Ray, Raoul was the mastermind behind the assassination. This claim became the spark that fueled decades of speculation and conspiracy theories. Despite Ray's assertions, though, investigators could never find credible evidence of a larger conspiracy. Multiple investigations followed, including a 1979 congressional inquiry by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. While the committee didn't rule out the possibility of a conspiracy entirely, it ultimately concluded that James Earl Ray was the lone gunman responsible for Dr. King's death. Ray spent the rest of his life in prison, continuously fighting for a new trial. His appeals were consistently denied. On April 23, 1998, he died behind bars from complication related to hepatitis C. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4, 1968 was a devastating blow, not just to the civil rights movement, but to the soul of the nation. And yet, as history often shows, tragedy has a way of amplifying voices rather than silencing them. Dr. King's death didn't end his message. In fact, it made it impossible to ignore. As the years passed, Dr. King's legacy only grew. his words and actions became a part of the very fabric of American history and culture. School children began to memorize lines from his I Have a Dream speech, and stories of the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign, and the Selma marches became cornerstones of civil rights education. His leadership with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference became the blueprint for peaceful protest around the world. In 1983, after years of advocacy from civil rights leaders and allies, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation creating Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The first official observance came in 1986, but it wasn't until 2000 that all 50 states formally recognized the holiday. And side note, Virginia, where I'm from, had Lee Jackson King Day until 2000, when they finally let Dr. King have his own day. Dr. King's life and his tragic death serve as a reminder of both the promise and the price of change. While his voice was silenced in Memphis, his dream was not. It is echoed through generations, inspiring people to stand up, speak out, and continue the fight for justice. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Dr. King's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!